Hello, everyone. I hope you will support the discussion in the comments and tell me what you would do if you found yourself in the situations I am going to talk about today. One summer afternoon, I was drinking tea by my kitchen window when I saw Carl, my next-door neighbor, standing unusually close to my driveway. Carl was in his 50s, retired, and had a penchant for poking his nose where it didn't belong. He liked things in their proper places, a fact he'd made clear over the years. But today, he was giving my car, the car I'd saved up for and owned for 5 years, a strange, assessing look, as if measuring it up. I didn't think much of it until later. The next morning, I found a note on my car windshield. It read, "This car is on my property. Move it or I will." I could hardly believe it. I'd parked that car in the same spot for years, and it was very clearly on my side of the line. When I confronted him about the note, Carl looked me dead in the eye and said, "The property lines might not be as clear as you think. That car might just be on my land." Now, I'm all for handling things calmly, so I asked if he wanted to double-check the property lines together. He smirked and replied, "I don't need a map to see what's mine. That car is mine now." I almost laughed. Almost. He was dead serious, and it became clear that this was more than just some passive-aggressive tactic. The next day, I found my car blocked in by a beat-up old truck with a "for sale" sign taped to my windshield. Carl had written his phone number on it. I was furious. I called him out, but he only shrugged and said, "I'll move my truck when I get my car keys. Or maybe you'd rather I call the authorities?" Oh, I was way ahead of him on that front. I called 911 right in front of him, explaining calmly that my neighbor was attempting to claim ownership of my vehicle. The police dispatcher didn't sound particularly amused, but she assured me that they'd send someone over. While we waited, Carl looked smug, as if he was sure they'd take his side. He even started whistling as if he had won some unspoken game. When the officers arrived, I explained the situation, showing them the deed to my property and my car's registration. Carl, though, had some tricks of his own. He claimed he had exclusive rights to part of my driveway due to an old easement agreement he supposedly found in his attic. The officers looked skeptical, and I had never heard of any easement. When they asked Carl for proof, he waved around some old yellowed documents. But after a quick inspection, the officers told him plainly that the papers didn't apply to my property. If anything, they were related to another lot that hadn't existed for decades. Carl's face turned red, and he stammered about modern boundaries and what was fair. At that point, I thought it was over. But a week later, I walked out to find my car missing. Panicking, I called the police and reported it stolen. They found it a few miles away. Carl had towed it himself to a shady mechanic and had it listed for sale. When the police showed up at the garage, Carl was there, smugly telling the mechanic to make sure it looked good for the potential buyer. Carl was taken down to the station, and I was advised to file a civil complaint against him for theft, tampering with property, and trespassing. He seemed to think he'd be out in no time, claiming that no one got hurt and it was all just a misunderstanding. But the officers explained that unauthorized towing, listing another person's car for sale, and attempting to claim ownership constituted theft and fraud. After several exhausting weeks in court, the judge ruled in my favor, and Carl was hit with hefty fines, restitution payments, and a restraining order. But that wasn't the end. As part of the punishment, he was also forced to cover all my legal expenses and pay me damages for the emotional distress he'd caused. His smug attitude dissolved pretty quickly once he realized he'd be paying for his games for years to come. Carl avoided me after that, and I can't say I missed his lingering stares. He eventually sold his house and moved away. Rumor had it to downsize after those hefty fines. His constant boundary pushing and self-righteous ownership backfired hard. Now, every time I park my car in my driveway, I think of Carl, wherever he ended up. Before the next story, I would like to ask you to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Let's move on to the next story. I first met Grumpy at an organization I'd gotten involved with right after high school. He'd been through some rough times himself, and after the organization helped him out, he returned to volunteer and give back. That's where he became my sponsor, and right from the start, I felt lucky to have him in my corner. Grumpy could see I was serious about getting my life on track, and when he found out I was looking for my first real job, he made a suggestion. He was the manager of a store for a large company specializing in building materials and tools, everything from bricks and cement to custom-made cabinets and landscaping materials. They'd been around for a few decades by then, and Grumpy's store was one of their mid-sized locations. He offered me a job as a loader, which meant I'd be responsible for getting the delivery trucks loaded and ready to go. It was tough work, no question, but I was more than ready to jump in. Plus, Grumpy wasn't just a boss to me. He was a mentor. I admired how he'd worked his way up from the very bottom, much like the spot I was in now. He started in the company at about the same age I was when he hired me, and he'd climbed his way up through sheer dedication and hard work. You could feel the respect everyone had for him. The company itself had an interesting history, one that mattered for how things would eventually unfold. Back in the early 80s, they had begun as a wholesaler, selling everything needed to build a solid brick-and-mortar home. As they grew, they gained a strong reputation for quality and affordability, especially for their power tools, custom cabinets, and landscaping materials. Their locations were essentially massive warehouses, stocking everything a contractor or serious DIYer could need. By the mid-90s, they'd opened their doors to the general public, and right around the time I joined, they were on their third phase of growth, transitioning away from heavy building materials like bricks and concrete and focusing more on things that sold well: custom furniture, high-quality tools, and even a growing range of plumbing supplies. They'd shifted to meet the changing market, and business was booming. For the first 8 months, working there was a dream. Grumpy's management style made all the difference. His philosophy was straightforward: happy employees do better work and deliver better service, and that brings in better sales. He didn't just say it, he lived by it. As a result, while our store wasn't the biggest in size, it was fourth in sales nationwide and ranked first in customer satisfaction. Even on tough days, you'd still find people in good spirits, and our customers noticed. Now, Grumpy didn't earn his nickname from his attitude. In fact, he was anything but grumpy. He was well-liked and always fair. The reason for the name was a medical condition that left him with a permanent frown, a quirk that he'd come to embrace over the years. He'd even passed on a promotion at one point, knowing the added stress would likely worsen his condition. For him, staying as a store manager where he could directly help his employees was more rewarding. Then, out of the blue, his condition flared up. It happened suddenly, and he had to be hospitalized and take an extended leave to recover. That's when everything started to change. Instead of letting one of Grumpy's trusted assistants fill in, the higher-ups decided to bring in a regional manager from outside to oversee the store. Enter Wilhelm. Wilhelm was practically the opposite of Grumpy in every way. He was younger, in his late 20s, and had climbed the corporate ladder quickly after joining the company with a business degree. Unlike Grumpy, Wilhelm had never worked on the floor or done any of the physical work. His career had been all about numbers, spreadsheets, and targets, and he was all business from day one. To make things worse, Wilhelm's placement in our store was part of a broader shift in the company's strategy. Because the company's focus had moved away from heavy construction materials, a lot of space in the stores had opened up. To fill that space, the company had partnered with a supermarket chain, renting out unused areas, especially in stores like ours in urban areas. The supermarket chain had a reputation for treating its employees poorly, and we heard horror stories about long hours, low pay, and constant pressure. One of our cashiers had worked there before joining us and had some tough stories about her experience. We weren't thrilled to see them coming in, and neither were our customers. But Wilhelm had his orders and wasted no time in reshaping the store to accommodate the new supermarket space. Wilhelm's style was simple: squeeze every possible dollar out of the store, no matter the cost. He scrapped our monthly schedules in favor of weekly ones, giving us little stability or time to plan. The sales targets shot up to ridiculous levels, far beyond anything we'd been asked to hit before. And within a few short weeks, 6 experienced employees were either forced out or fired, replaced with young, inexperienced hires who didn't know any better and were easier to push around. Morale took a sharp nosedive. As the supermarket set up shop, things only got worse. Wilhelm decided that the loading crew, us, would now have to help unload the supermarket's trucks as well. These trucks often arrived during our busiest hours, so this was no small task. We were supposed to handle all of it without any overtime. Wilhelm made it clear he wouldn't approve extra pay, even though helping the supermarket meant longer shifts for all of us. He brushed off any pushback, saying we were lucky to be getting our early morning hours as it was and didn't need any more compensation. The store that had once been a great place to work was quickly becoming a nightmare. Despite the growing frustrations, we tried to make it work. But Wilhelm kept pushing us harder, and it felt like no matter how much effort we put in, it was never enough for him. With the loading crew, Wilhelm's new rules completely messed up our schedule. Our shifts started at 5 a.m., and typically, we'd have the trucks loaded and ready to go by 7 o'clock, allowing them to get out on their routes on time. This was especially important because our store had a next-day delivery policy within a 150-mile radius, so timing was crucial. But Wilhelm's priorities were now entirely on the supermarket's deliveries. Since most of their goods were perishable, he demanded we unload their trucks first, regardless of our own delivery schedule. This meant we often couldn't start loading our trucks until around 7:30 a.m., making our drivers late by hours. Customers who'd grown used to the reliable service we'd built up under Grumpy were getting frustrated, and complaints started pouring in. It was painful to watch all the hard work we'd done slowly unravel, all because Wilhelm had decided our schedule didn't matter. Of course, we asked about overtime, figuring the least he could do was compensate us for the extra hours we had to put in. But Wilhelm wouldn't budge. He acted like we were doing him a personal favor by showing up at all, and insisted that we already made plenty with our early morning hours. To him, Going home at 1 p.m. meant we were getting off easy, even though we'd put in a full day's worth of work by then. As a result, we were stuck doing double duty without any extra pay, watching our workload pile up while he tried to squeeze every drop of productivity out of us. In just a month, things went from bad to worse. 10 of my colleagues in the loading crew quit, unable to handle the impossible demands. Wilhelm replaced them with inexperienced hires who barely lasted a week or two before either leaving or getting fired for not meeting his standards. Those of us who stayed were clinging to our jobs out of sheer necessity. Some of us needed the paycheck, others were trying to avoid unemployment, and the younger hires didn't know any better and were willing to put up with the conditions, at least for a while. The floor staff wasn't faring any better either. People were coming and going so fast that it felt like you could barely learn someone's name before they were gone. And yet Wilhelm was unrelenting. He had one goal: drive up profits, no matter what it did to the work environment or the people who kept the store running. Customer happiness dropped sharply. Regulars who used to come to our store because of the personal touch and great service started noticing the cracks. Even though our sales took only a slight dip, it was clear that if things continued this way, the store's reputation would only get worse. But Wilhelm didn't care. He was too focused on his own goals, and as long as HQ saw the numbers he wanted them to see, he figured he was untouchable. We were all miserable. Those of us who'd been there since before Wilhelm arrived, the so-called old guard, were starting to talk about quitting en masse. At first, it was just talk. But as Wilhelm's demands continued to push us harder, it became clear that something would have to give. We were barely hanging on, and many of us had already started searching for other jobs. It seemed like every week someone new would leave, and our core team was thinning out faster than we could replace people. Then, just as things were reaching a breaking point, Grumpy returned. 6 months after his medical leave began, Grumpy finally walked back through the doors of our store. There was no grand entrance, no speech or dramatic moment. He was simply back, and the relief was like a wave over all of us. His face was as stoic as ever, though he moved a little slower, leaning on a cane. He was still recovering and had been cleared only for light duties for a couple of weeks before he could fully take on the responsibilities of managing the store again. But even in those first few moments, just seeing him gave us hope that things might turn around. We threw a modest welcome back gathering, keeping it simple but heartfelt. For the first time in a long time, we felt like things might return to normal. Grumpy had been the heart of the store, and with him back, maybe the nightmare Wilhelm had created could finally be put to an end. Of course, Wilhelm didn't waste any time trying to remind us who was still in charge. As the regional manager, Wilhelm technically outranked Grumpy, and he made sure we knew it. In private meetings with each department, he dropped not-so-subtle reminders that if any of us dared complain about him to Grumpy, we'd be out the door. He didn't want us filling Grumpy in on what had happened during his absence, and he made sure we understood the consequences if we did. For a while, it seemed like we'd have to wait even longer to see things change. Still, a few of us quietly planned to meet with Grumpy once his 2-week light duty period was over. We knew we'd have to be cautious and give him time to settle back in, but we were determined to let him know the reality of what Wilhelm had put us through. Unfortunately, Wilhelm's reign of control extended even to our plans. Anytime someone tried to raise an issue, he was right there to shut it down, making it nearly impossible to get a private word with Grumpy. But there was one department Wilhelm hadn't been able to control: the workshop. The custom furniture workshop had been a big part of our store's success, and the head carpenter there had been with the company for years. Wilhelm had known better than to mess with them too much, knowing that if he did, the decline in quality and productivity would be too obvious to ignore. The custom furniture was one of the store's biggest sellers, and Wilhelm couldn't afford for that department to fall apart. So he left them relatively untouched compared to the rest of us, and that's where the real turning point came. On Grumpy's second day back, the head carpenter requested a meeting with him. Under the guise of discussing the future of the workshop, he laid out everything Wilhelm had been doing. The carpenter spilled every detail about Wilhelm's harsh treatment of the staff, the ridiculous sales targets, and the forced labor in the supermarket section without overtime pay. Grumpy, ever the calm and composed figure, simply listened. But those who saw him afterwards said they could tell something had shifted. Grumpy was angry, and for someone as steady and even-tempered as him, that was saying something. From that point on, Grumpy took a careful approach. With the excuse of catching up on the store's current state, he scheduled meetings with each of us. He listened as we recounted the past 6 months, filling him in on how Wilhelm had run things and the toll it had taken. Each meeting seemed to deepen his resolve. By the time he'd spoken to everyone, it was clear that he was ready to take action. Once Grumpy had spoken with everyone, he knew he couldn't let things stand as they were. Wilhelm's treatment of the staff, his disregard for proper scheduling, and his refusal to approve overtime were only part of the story. Grumpy had also caught wind of something even more troubling through his conversation with the head carpenter. Apparently, Wilhelm had an arrangement with the supermarket manager. Wilhelm had been receiving kickbacks in exchange for forcing us to help out the supermarket with unpaid labor. Essentially, he was profiting off our hard work while making life as miserable as possible for everyone under his management. Grumpy didn't jump into action right away. Instead, he took a few days to strategize and gather more information. He knew that the best way to handle this would be through careful planning, and he wanted to make sure he didn't miss anything. Part of that involved reaching out to the manager of the supermarket himself. Under the guise of a casual conversation, Grumpy managed to confirm that Wilhelm's kickback arrangement was real. The supermarket manager thought Grumpy might want in on the scheme, so he let some details slip, thinking Grumpy would be interested in the same kind of under-the-table deal. Grumpy was now armed with enough information to take Wilhelm down, but he wanted to do it in a way that would make a lasting impact, both for the sake of the store and for all of us who had endured Wilhelm's reign of terror. He called a mandatory store meeting, telling us to come in after closing hours for an announcement. We all knew something big was coming, and there was a sense of anticipation in the air as we gathered in the quiet, empty store that evening. When Grumpy finally stepped up to speak, he looked around at each of us with that familiar, stern look that was more comforting than anything. He started by thanking us for holding things together during his absence, acknowledging how hard it had been. Then he got to the point. He was going to take action against Wilhelm, and he wanted us all on board. His plan was bold but simple. He instructed us to stay home for the next few days. If anyone from HQ or the regional office called, we were to direct them straight to Grumpy. No explanations, no details, just a united front. We weren't going to show up for work, and we weren't going to back down. Over the next few days, we stayed home as Grumpy advised. Calls from HQ and the regional office started coming in, and true to our agreement, we directed every single one of them to Grumpy. HQ quickly grew concerned about the unexpected closure of one of their busiest stores and demanded an explanation. Grumpy's response was swift and direct. He told them that every staff member had been working a second job during their shifts, a direct breach of contract, and therefore he had been left with no choice but to fire the entire team. This got HQ's attention, and they demanded evidence. Grumpy didn't hesitate. He provided written testimonies from each of us, describing in detail how Wilhelm had forced us to work for the supermarket on the same shifts, unpaid, and under threat of losing our jobs if we refused. Grumpy laid out the arrangement between Wilhelm and the supermarket manager, including the kickbacks Wilhelm had received. He made it clear that not only had Wilhelm violated company policies, but he'd also put the entire company at legal risk by refusing to approve overtime and forcing us to work unpaid hours. As HQ reviewed the documents Grumpy provided, the situation spiraled quickly for Wilhelm. The company couldn't ignore the potential for legal trouble, especially since Grumpy also pointed out that if any of us were to take our complaints to the labor department, the fines and penalties would be substantial. HQ realized they had a problem on their hands, a problem named Wilhelm. Within days, Wilhelm was removed from his position and fired. The fallout was significant, and the company scrambled to address the damage. They couldn't afford to lose experienced staff, especially given how many of us had been ready to walk out. To address the situation, they reached out to each of us individually, asking us to re-interview for our old positions. It was mostly a formality, but it gave them an opportunity to show us that they were serious about fixing the mess Wilhelm had made. As part of the offer, they included a severance package for each of us, plus compensation for most of the unpaid overtime we'd accrued. While it wasn't the full amount, we got around 80% of what was owed to us, which was far better than we'd expected. Grumpy also secured a small pay raise for those of us who chose to return, acknowledging the experience and loyalty we'd shown in sticking it out through Wilhelm's nightmare tenure. A handful of people chose not to return, but the majority of us came back, feeling more secure and valued than we had in months. The company took a hard look at the supermarket chain too. The kickback scheme had left a sour taste, and though the supermarket's lease still had time remaining, HQ decided to minimize contact between our two teams. They stopped any shared employee arrangements, which meant the supermarket had to manage with its own staff from then on. The supermarket team wasn't thrilled about this, and a fair number of their employees ended up switching over to our side. We welcomed them in, and with Grumpy back at the helm, they quickly saw the difference between working under a manager who cared about his people versus one who only cared about numbers. Grumpy's leadership brought the stability and positivity back almost instantly. His management style, which had felt like a distant memory under Wilhelm's rule, returned in full force. He knew that if he looked after us, we'd look after the customers, and that would naturally drive sales. Sure enough, our sales and customer satisfaction rebounded quickly. Within weeks, we were back to being one of the top-performing stores in the region, and our regular customers seemed to pick up on the change. They'd missed the warmth and personal touch that had been Grumpy's hallmark, and they were happy to see it restored. The change was so effective that HQ took notice. When Grumpy needed to take time off again, the company didn't make the same mistake twice. Instead of bringing in another regional manager, they promoted one of his assistants to take over in his absence. Two of his most trusted assistants ended up doing a stellar job, eventually leading them to become managers at other stores. Grumpy's influence had a ripple effect, creating a new generation of managers who understood the importance of respecting and supporting their teams. As for me, I stayed with the company for another 3 years before moving on to a better-paying job. But even years later, I still look back on those days with Grumpy as some of the best of my career. He taught me more than just the ropes of the job. He showed me what it meant to be a real leader, someone who puts his people first. To this day, Grumpy remains one of the best managers I've ever had, and I'll always be grateful for the example he set. Thank you for watching.